Welcome everyone to the Fermentation Association's webinar of the forefront of alt proteins in Africa. I'm Amelia Nielsen-Stoll, editor of TFA. We are a trade group that was launched to support producers who use fermentation to create delicious and often healthful food and beverages. Our goals are to help educate consumers about fermentation and its benefits, support scientific research into those health benefits, and work with food safety authorities to establish clearer and more appropriate regulations in regards to fermentation. Today, we bring you three great speakers: Brett Thompson, co-founder and CEO of Mzansi Meat; Leah Bessa, PhD, co-founder and CSO of DeNovo Dairy, sorry, Leah; and Josephine Wee, PhD, professor of food science at Penn State University. We have many questions already submitted and reviewed with our speakers. If there are additional topics you'd like to see addressed, please enter them in the chat below and we will try to get to them. I will come back at the end to ask some of our audience questions. For now, I will turn it over to you, Josephine.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Can everyone hear me okay? Brett, Leah, especially? Awesome. All right. Leah, Brett, before we get started, it's my tradition to always ask about superpowers. So tell us briefly about yourself. And if you were to choose a superpower, what would it be and why? We'll start with Leah.
Hi, I'm Leah Bessa. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. I have a background in food science, and I've focused mainly on alternative proteins throughout my studies and in companies. If I had a power, I'd want to teleport, because
Leah, I think your connection is a little, I think the audio is going in and out. So how about we go to Brett and then Leah, maybe
just go everywhere, anywhere at just the click of my fingers.
Sorry about that. Having some connection. Brett, how about we go with you, Brett? Tell us briefly about yourself, and if you had a superpower, what would it be and why?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much to everyone for putting this together and for having me. My background has also just been in food. I've been working in food marketing for about 10 years, only in the alternative protein space and animal advocacy space. So always excited about why we make food choices and sort of the motivations behind them. I think if I could, after about a year and a half of lockdown, I could think what I would do is having webinars where there are no internet issues. If I could have that superpower, I think that's what I'd like to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Brett. So I'll do a brief introduction about myself and then go back to Leah. I'm Dr. Josephine Wee. I'm an assistant professor at Penn State. My lab focuses on research related to food-associated fungi. So we look to understand how fungi can contribute to food safety, quality, and sustainability. And if I were to have a superpower, I would definitely say being at two places at once. Leah, would you like to try again?
Yeah, sorry. You know, it's
no
one
worries.
of the joys of being in Africa.
No worries. We can hear you clearly now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I have a background in food science, so I've spent a lot of time working in the alternative protein space, ranging from insects to superpower. I would love to be able to teleport. I'd love to be able to travel, miss traffic, and also just get anywhere that I wanted instantaneously.
Awesome. Thank you, Leah. All right. So I'm going to share some slides to get us started. Do this. All right, perfect. So we've been in a lot of webinars in the last year. So I thought we'll kind of establish some kind of goals for this webinar so that by the end of it, we can get some learning outcomes out of it. So one of my hopes is that we're able to discuss and learn more about the landscape of cultured meat and dairy in South Africa, as well as the region. And would love to hear more about Mzansi Meat and DeNovo Dairy from Leah and Brett, as well as identify strengths and opportunities in alternative proteins in South Africa. So what are alternative proteins? I got this definition from the Good Food Institute that defines alternative proteins as meat, egg, or dairy products that are derived or made, derived or either from ingredients or processing from plant-based, cultured and cultivated, which we'll talk more about today, or fermentation derived. So as a food scientist, I like to think of how we make these products. As a food scientist, I think about technology and processes that are on the y-axis and ingredients and products that are on the x-axis. So for example, traditional fermentation gave rise to our delicious cheeses and yogurt of the world, right? And you think of them in this quadrant here as more active ingredients, all the way down to more inert ingredients. What that means is they don't have any bioactive compounds or components, for example, mycoprotein that's produced by corn. And then when you go up the y-axis, you think about I think about this as more sophisticated technology. You start getting into amino acids and vitamins that are more purified, growth factors, enzymes. So these are more, we borrow a lot of these processes from drug manufacturing and biotechnology. So I like to think about fermentation from this lens of technology and processes versus ingredients and products. Okay, so when we think about alternative proteins that are made by fermentation, what do we mean by this? Tofu is an example of a completely plant-based product. So you think of derived from soybeans, all the way down to fully cultured or cultivated products, for example, synthetic gelatin, and there are others making, for example, cultivated fat. So there is a huge continuum. And when we think about the future of alternative proteins, they would most likely fall in this area here of hybrid products. So what does that mean? Hybrid products are typically made from bulk ingredients, so biomass from plant-based food or sources, and then ingredients that are made with more precision fermentation that are added to the mix. So here are some examples of plant-based and cell-based companies that are in the space. Definitely have to add Mzansi and DeNovo Dairy here. We think about them as dairy, beef, poultry, all the way to seafood. So I'm going to stop this share now, and so we can see everyone and have a chat. All right. Perfect. Okay, so I'll go first to Brett and ask Brett to tell us more about the mission of Mzansi and why and how did he find the company or founded the company.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that was a really good illustration of like sort of the process that a lot of the companies around the world are looking at when it comes to cultivated meat. I think in the beginning, it was definitely probably a one size, make the whole thing, make an end product, beef burger or whatever it is. But now I think a lot of cultivated meat companies are seeing the opportunity in cultivated fats and other ways of sort of getting closer to market probably quite quicker. Just a little bit about our company. We are a company based out of Cape Town, South Africa, and we are Africa's first cultivated meat company. We want to make a beef burger. That is our first product that we want to bring to market. And probably a second product that we want to be bringing is what we call here in South Africa, boerewors. I see somebody from Namibia, so they might know what that means, but that is a sausage, very traditional to South Africa, and it's got a lot of delicious fat, and it's about 30% fat. And we're also seeing the opportunity within fat, and we're really excited about it. So those are the two products that we want to do to bring to South Africa as soon as possible. But when I look at the mission of the company and how we started, it was started by myself and Jay van der Walt and Tasneem Korodia, we're all based in South Africa, and we have a lot of drives towards sustainability, and particularly when it comes to animal advocacy. I've been working in animal advocacy for about 10 years, Jay 15 odd, really driven about creating a model of food system that can displace the need to take use animals, the cow behind me, in a way where that animal has to die. And I think that's a key driver for the company and what started us. But I think the biggest opportunity, or it was an opportunity in Africa and South Africa that we saw after both spending time working with startups. Jay worked with startups in Japan, cultivated meats, as well as the States, and I was living in Germany, seeing the growth in the space and looking into Africa and seeing that there was nobody doing it. So we were the first ones to do it, and that was last year. The cultivated meat industry and cellular agriculture industry is nearly 10 years old, and we were the first ones to bring it to the continent. So I think it's that opportunistic entrepreneurial mindset in South Africa to come and do it here, and also really to make a big impact for the lives of animals, and ultimately look to be part of the solution in Africa when it comes to food security. South Africans don't eat enough food, they don't eat enough protein, they don't get enough nutrients. It's a very different conversation to the rest of the world. It's about getting more protein into more people's stomachs and plates. And I think those are sort of 2 or 3 of the key drivers for our company. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brett. I think you sharing about the context of the region that you're in is a really crucial one. Advancing alternative proteins in the US is very different from Asia and very different in South Africa. And I think that's a really important context or lens that we should look at in our conversation today as well. Leah, I'll turn it over to you. Would you like to share a little bit more with us about DeNovo Dairy and the mission of your company and what motivated you to start the company?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm just awkwardly going to turn my video off when I speak, but I'll turn it back on when I'm done. Yeah, so DeNovo Dairy is basically using precision fermentation to produce functional dairy proteins. But yeah, I think I might have been lost again.
We can hear you, Leah.
Oh,
all good.
Okay, great. Okay. Having a monologue with myself then. So we're basically using precision fermentation to produce
We may have lost Leah.
And we're focusing on dairy to start off with. And the idea behind this is really when you look at the market, a lot of consumers are not willing to move away from dairy products because they really love that eating experience they have with dairy products.
I think Leah dropped off. Brett,
I'll get a talking hand and
no worries.
Do a Leah impression. Yeah.
Yep. So no problem. So we'll go to some questions now that were sent in to us. And Brett, just kind of to set the tone a little bit, the questions typically surround technology and scalability. So the questions that came in from participants mainly related to the process and scalability, and then consumer perception and food choice. And then finally on the whole idea of sustainability and feasibility, right? Which I'm sure you get a lot of these questions. So Brett, the first question I want to start with is related to scalability. Meat is complex, as you mentioned. You mentioned a traditional meat product that looks like a sausage that's 30% fat. So in your mind, because meat is so complex, what do you see as the largest challenges related to scalability when it comes to meat?
Look, I think when it comes to cultivated meat, the biggest issues that we're finding as a company is getting capital. So as of a year ago, there was no money flowing into the space. So that was one of the first initial hurdles that we had to jump through. We've broken through that. We're finding a lot of interest from investors from all over the world, and key differences in South Africa as well. There's been a change in mindset and being very excited and interested in the space. We were having to convince South African investors about cellular agriculture and then international investors about South Africa. So it was putting us in a bit of a double-edged sword almost. Now that capital is available, it's definitely within the equipment that we need to be able to acquire and produce that's bespoke for cultivated meat. Up until now, we've been looking at using medical grade bioreactors and equipment and trying to retrofit them to cultivated meat. They're very expensive and they aren't exactly what we need. We're in that process of going from a pilot or a bench scale into the pilot production scale right now, and being able to create bespoke machinery that's designed with a focus on cultivated meat, not medical research or the like, is a key component of being able to produce at scale. And those things are costly, but the benefit is that it's a bit cheaper to do stuff in South Africa. So when we actually tell some of our investors about our capex costs, they kind of fall off their chair because it is a lot more cheaper to do stuff in South Africa. So I think it's a challenge, but it's also the opportunity that we find down here. And then the sort of last two in that as well is the media. It requires a lot of media to go and grow meat in the space that we're working from, and it's too expensive for what it needs to be, particularly in the African context. It's very, very price sensitive consumers here. And finally is talent, getting the right talent. And at the moment, it's the same case of us retrofitting folks that are medical, pharma, sports injury, etc., and bringing them into food. But you can imagine in 5 years, it's going to be cellular agriculture could be far more established industry that people focus on achieving, going towards earlier on in their studies, opposed to maybe something that they think about doing at a later stage. So I look at about 2 or 3 things that are kind of the hindrance, but as well as the opportunity for achieving scale in South Africa.
All right. Thank you so much, Brett, for sharing. And the vision that you painted on costly equipment is one that I see in a lot of illustrations in different articles on large bioreactors that in some ways it's almost difficult to imagine in a country. So I'm originally from Malaysia, thinking about these large bioreactors in a developing nation, right? So I can definitely understand where you're coming from with the cost efficiency there. So we'll come back to the conversation on talent and the mindset of South Africans in a little bit. Leah, I'd like to give you an opportunity to continue to tell us a little bit more about DeNovo Dairy's mission. We lost you there for a little bit. I apologize, everyone, for the connection. Leah, tell us a little bit about DeNovo Dairy's mission and how you founded the company and what motivated you.
Awesome. Of course. So DeNovo Dairy is using precision fermentation to produce functional dairy proteins. And the reason behind this is really because when you look at dairy, the proteins are responsible for that characteristic mouthfeel and stench, reasons why consumers are not moving away from dairy, because they really truly love that eating experience. And so in order to do that, the best way to do that is really to recreate those dairy proteins and make sure that they're identical. And using precision fermentation, which is such a powerful tool, you can create those nature identical dairy proteins, which you can then use in quite a diverse set of dairy products. And even beyond that, I mean, dairy is used in a lot of food products as well for nutrition. So we're really focusing on function and nutrition when we were producing these dairy proteins. But I think what's really great about precision fermentation is, as a technology, it's not limited to just 1 or 2 proteins. You can really explore other functional elements and other functional proteins across the food industry. So we're really looking beyond just dairy, but we want to solve a big problem in the industry, and that is dairy, because it's very unsustainable. And I caught the last bit there of Brett's conversation where, cost is a really big thing in South Africa, and using precision fermentation scalable potential to drive costs down of producing dairy proteins without animals. So it's really a combination of using technology to create functionality and nutrition, but really bearing in mind that cost element so that we can reach, our markets and further north as well, which is Africa.
Thank you, Leah. While you mentioned about protein functionality and the different proteins that are in milk, and one of the big conversations about milk proteins are allergenicity, I was wondering what your company is doing relative to potential to have a dairy product that are free of allergens. Would you like to share a little bit with us in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. So as it stands at the moment, we're just firstly trying to achieve nature identical proteins so that they will still have allergenicity. Impact.
Leah,
but the idea is really to start changing epitopes in the proteins to reduce the allergenicity or remove it entirely, but that is quite a long.
Brett, I think from my end, I'm hearing the connection going in and out.
Yeah, it's not playable.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right, Brett. So I am not sure if you wanted to add anything about the allergenicity component of proteins.
Allergies, is that what? Sorry, was that the question?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
the potential to have labels that are then allergen-free with alternative proteins.
Look, I think I worked at a company for 10 years making plant-based protein, and allergens were an issue. Sulfites, gluten-free, what you name it, they're there still, even when it comes to plant-based. It definitely helps. There's a ability to control the environment a little bit more when you're producing from one facility. I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet, to be honest. I think it's going to be a step forward. Particularly, I mean, if I look from the, there's probably more on that side of the fence with milk and lactose and all that kind of things. I think there's probably an ability to do that there. When it comes to what we're doing, I mean, we're making meats. So anyone at the end of the day that has any issues with eating meats in that sort of in its conventional format now, it still would be applicable to what we also hope to achieve at a later stage. I do think, though, that there will be some level of influence that we might be able to have in the future, whether it's to knock out some of those allergies, but it's probably something that I wouldn't focus on too much at our company just yet. Probably more important for a dairy company because there's, in an African context, there's a lot of people that are lactose intolerant, for example. So it's an opportunity there, to be honest. Yeah, I think for us, it's the ability to maybe kick out a few things that might be hormones, antibiotics, etc. That's possibly where we would be looking at a bit more than allergies.
Thank you, Brett, for shedding some light on how to think about that, because sometimes with allergies and toxins, we're so focused on it that we kind of move away from the mission of creating sustainable abundancy and the scalability issues, right? So I think, from your response there, it made me think about how allergenicity and toxins in food have always existed for centuries, right? It shouldn't take away from advancing the field of alternative proteins. Brett, sorry, did you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that, just from a practical point of view of like what you said, how it takes away focus. I was involved, at least on the very sidelines, in the comms department, trying to talk through a food factory going from non-gluten-free to having the ability to have gluten-free. And that was an extensively costly exercise. You don't get it right, firstly, in the beginning. You get product out to some that then say, oh, your restaurant range is now gluten-free. No, it's not. So I think for anyone on the call that's listening, it's like there are these massive costs to try and get those like soy-free, gluten-free, this like labels out, which there might be a bit of a trade-off that I think needs to be considered. And particularly for an emerging industry, the protein alternative industry, going too focused into the free food or the free from foods, I also think puts you into a niche component, which I don't want to be in. I don't want to be a vegan company. I don't want to be an allergy sensitive company. I want to be a meat company. And I think that's where you will have the most impact by playing in the more conventional space opposed to the sidelines.
Thank you, Brett.
Sorry, can I jump in there quickly?
Of course, Leah. Yes, we can.
Okay. So on the allergenicity, it is something that we're exploring. I think it's just maybe a longer process to achieve, because we would then need to do clinical trials to really validate that it is allergen free. And so there is an additional step to that. But I think what is great about being able to manipulate the DNA of the whey or the casein that you're producing is that you do have that potential to change the allergenicity. I think it also might just be a slight challenge, because then you also then probably need to prove safety, because then it's not exactly the same as whey or casein that has been consumed for many years. So then you can't claim that it's nature identical. So there's, I think, two challenges to going down that route, but I think it has such huge potential, especially for people from a nutritional point of view, because then you can actually have these really high nutritional proteins that are allergen free, so that it can, anyone can consume it without any issues. So I think it's huge potential.
I agree. And to this question on scalability and feasibility, when you think about the technology, you brought up a really important point about regulations as well, and labeling, which is a whole other hurdle that we can talk about a little later when it comes to feasibility and marketability. So I can completely see that kind of inclusion in a product like what you're making with DeNovo Dairy, that consumers can get the nutrients that they need. My little one cannot take dairy. She has an allergy. So, the ability to have products that can still provide the nutrition requirements for a growing child, minus the allergy, would be, in my mind, a game changer. And so that kind of brings me to the next segment of how we think about alternative proteins related to consumer perception and food choice. And Leah, when we have you, how do you think the alternative protein industry can empower rather than displace traditional agriculture in South Africa, and more importantly, the region? Because from my reading, South Africa is very diverse with a lot of ethnicity. I think I read something like your national anthem has like 5 different languages. So that's something I learned in the last week. So tell us about this context of how do you think alternative proteins and this conversation of cellular agriculture can empower rather than displace traditional agriculture?
Yeah, we have 11 official languages, so we're the Rainbow Nation, which is really cool. I think that's a really cool question. I think people think, these high tech proteins are going to take over traditional agriculture, but I think what's important to also highlight is the fact that a lot of small scale farmers in South Africa, and a lot of farmers, their kids are no longer going to be farmers anymore, because they've gone to universities and they've developed these skills. So there's this huge move from rural settings to urban settings, and those kids are not going back to the farmlands to take over the farms. And I think what's important then is that those skills can be used for, let's just say, novel farming or more high-tech farming. And so I think it's quite a natural evolution from land agriculture to urban agriculture. So I think it actually works quite well, and it's happening quite simultaneously, because no one is actually going to be there to take over those farms, because those upskilled youths are no longer going back home to farm. So I think it's quite a nice synergy, and I don't think it's going to take over. I think it's just going to sort of work hand in hand, and where traditional agriculture is under a lot of pressure, and then they treat the animals badly, urban agriculture can alleviate that so that they can start farming sustainably. So I think it actually is quite a great synergy to solve the bigger problems in agriculture, and also how jobs are changing for the future.
Yeah, I really like the point that you brought up about synergy and sort of this co-creation, and how the timing is relevant. That I think sort of the thing that you shared with me was that farmers probably wouldn't have children that would go into and take over farms in the future. Brett, you mentioned something earlier on about talent. That was one of the barriers in cell ag and alternative protein space. I wondered if you wanted to comment on this idea of empowering rather than displacing or replacing traditional agriculture in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it luckily comes down to our name, Mzansi. I didn't tell anyone what it means, but it actually, firstly, it's Zulu or isiXhosa, and it literally means South. It's a colloquial term for South Africa, and we wanted to choose a word to embody our company, because that embodied South Africa and that everybody could relate to. So that sort of inclusion, or that being not an antagonistic force, but rather one that works with the system to develop change, was a key driver in the mission of the company. And for myself, I mean, I want to see a complete rechange and a shift away from requiring animals to be slaughtered. But I'm also knowing, to be pragmatic, that's one of the best ways that we can possibly achieve change. When it comes to sort of the traditional sense that we have, we're very mindful of that at our company. And it's lucky that our PR officer, and she works also with government liaisons, Absi, she's the daughter of a cattle farmer. She works in food service. She works with the red meat industry. She's having these conversations with them on a daily basis. We're learning a lot from that. And we're also getting an understanding of how important the Nguni cattle, which is behind me, is in the African culture. We want to really respect that. We want to actually embrace the culture of South Africa, and that's where we want to find is our niche. And then being able to, there's an addition, we need to almost increase our protein consumption in South Africa. That might not be able to come from a drought-stricken South Africa, Cape Town, where I'm from. We had a massive drought. We've had issues with meat stocks. Cellular agriculture has the ability to stabilize and improve food security and protein availability, as opposed to sort of disrupt it. I think you might see in 10, 20, 30 years time, a shift within the traditional industry towards more cellular agriculture as the costs become improved. But in the meantime, it's actually going to be an assistance. It's going to enable the buyers at the retail level to sort of guarantee their tonnage of meat, opposed to being quite volatile, which it is in South Africa. We now, because we're coming on the back of a drought, there's been an oversupply of weaners. Now we're going to have too many, there's going to be too much meat and then there's issues with exporting and everything as well. So again, I think it's probably going to have, if it's embraced by the industry, the conventional industry, it's going to have the ability to stabilize food security in the country in the long run. Maybe not in the meantime, because it is going to be more expensive, but in the ultimate it will. And the final component, through the work that UPSI is going to be doing, we are talking to subsistence farmers. We want to get cell lines from subsistence farmers in the Eastern Cape and get those cattle, the Nguni, the Nkola cattle that are indigenous to Africa, and take them to the rest of the world. We're giving them, our goal is to give subsistence farmers a potential additional revenue stream opposed to what they have at the moment. So I think there's a framing that we are looking at it, that other industries in the cultivated industry can look at it hopefully as well, that embraces the culture of a country instead of trying to fight it.
Brett, I really love the point that you brought up about embracing culture. It reminds me of how Singapore's approach to cultivated meat as well, that they looked at seafood being a major kind of, interlinked with culture in the region. And that's why they pushed forth with seafood, cultured seafood. And then I think about Korea with the Wagyu beef, which is very inherent to the culture itself. And I'm seeing similar sort of stories being told on embracing culture and including the existing industry, traditional agriculture as well. I know you alluded to the unique infrastructure being really expensive. Other than infrastructure and talent, how about like this kind of initial transition from the consumer's point of view? Are you seeing across the spectrum kind of I don't want to say acceptance, because we don't want to just have people accept things, but more engagement all throughout kind of different generations? And then I'll transition to Leah to that question.
Yeah, and just one other anecdote or sort of story. In South Africa, we just had Heritage Day, which was last week. Okay, so Heritage Day is, I guess, almost equivalent to like July 4th or something, or Independence Day or something along those lines. That's been renamed almost colloquially as Braai Day or Barbecue Day. So just again, back to that cultural component, how important meat is in South Africa outside of just, oh, I'm going to go grab a burger. But just to your point, I think what we've found, and we've done some research on this as well, so it's backed up by a little bit of research, where we surveyed about 1,000 South Africans. Well, actually, it's my non-profit Credence Institute, so it was separate to Mzansi, where we surveyed about 1,000 South Africans, demographically representative, because it's a predominantly Black African country, and we asked them questions about what they think about plant-based and cultivated meat. Through that, we were able to look at some of the early adopters, and around about 50% of those survey responders said that they were willing and likely to purchase cultivated meat when it becomes widely available. I found that very encouraging, and particularly by the one other component was that they were willing to pay more. And if you factor in the fact that they were also lower income on average as well, compared to what you guys might think, and also comparison to in South Africa, these are some sort of real key drivers to say that there is an openness to what we're doing, there is an excitement about it, and there's a drive from an environmental reason. And I think a lot of people that are living, particularly in rural areas and everything, are far more subject to volatile climate, and are starting to ask questions and looking at alternatives as well. So I think the data is starting to seems to suggest that there is interest. Your average South African is going to be willing to purchase this, and at a higher level, higher price level, but we just got to make it available. And I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle for us. Getting it into retail and getting it in front of people so that they can make that decision. And it can't be, the price is going to be the biggest factor at the end of the day. And if we don't get to that, then we're not going to be able to advance the industry. And that's the kind of thing that's really driving us. And I think once we've sort of factored a lot of those things in, I think consumers in South Africa are willing and open to it, because they love meat at the end of the day. They don't really maybe are attached too much of how it got to their place. And I think a lot of people are starting to understand how conventional, particularly in the chicken industry, has resulted into quite a lot of questions on animal welfare. All these things are drivers, but plant-based, after 10 years of trying to get people in South Africa to eat plant-based, is not is going to get a fraction of the population to eat. But when you're wanting to get the sort of mass market, it's got to be meat. It really has to be meat, and that's where I think Mzansi is going to be able to jump in.
Thank you, Brett. That's really encouraging. So you said something like 50% of consumers are willing to try at least, and also willing to pay more because of the environmental impact and sustainability. Leah, what do you think from the alternative dairy or cultivated dairy, fermented dairy front? How are consumers' perception towards animal-free milk or dairy?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate on Brett's point, I mean, South Africans are very conservative. So not so much from a technology point of view, but they really don't like moving away from things that they know and love. So they love meat, they love dairy. And I think that's what's so important about creating nature identical, dairy or nature identical meat. And I think that makes it an easier transition for consumers to move to. So I think the engagement is going to be continuous in that sort of open dialogue about the technology to sort of create familiarity. But I think the key is really going to be engagement with the products, so that consumers, when they taste it, it tastes exactly like what they expect. And I think that's going to be the key point in getting consumers to buy into it. When they know that it is the same, it tastes the same, it's got the same nutrition, it's going to be a very easy sell. Once again, the cost is going to be a huge factor, and that's why it's really important for between Brett's company and our company is really to drive those costs down. But I do think from a technology point of view, they did a worldwide study, and sort of in the third world countries, there was actually more acceptance of precision fermentation to produce alternative dairies than there was in first world countries, which I found very, very interesting. And I think the idea behind that is that third world countries, being a bit more conservative in their consumption patterns, want something that they're used to. They don't want to move away from what they love in terms of taste, texture, and nutrition. So that's really what we're targeting. And I think cost is going to be the big thing, and just continuous consumer engagement once the product is tangible.
Thank you, Leah. Brett, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to just tag on a little bit again about if you look at other sort of leapfrog industries, particularly in your East Africa, where mobile payments, etc., caught on better, and the mobile fintech is better there than almost anywhere else in the continent, and maybe in the emerging markets. I think there's also this hunger and youth that you got, not literally in like this people not being able to get enough food, but like in terms of new ideas, fresh ideas. It's a young population. Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, or Kenya, young populations willing to try new things as well when they are at a price point that's available to them. And I think there's not as much legacy. My favorite story is when I was on a podcast a year ago with somebody from a poultry industry in Kenya and it was a beef or fish industry in Zambia, I think. And by the end of it, we're just talking about protein. That's what everybody's interested in. The industry there, particularly in other parts of Africa, are interested in getting protein to people. And they're not really hung up on where it gets, too much of where it gets there. The decentralized process of how you do that, and the fact that the supply chains in certain parts of Africa are very, very different to what we know in South Africa and the rest of the world. That's a hurdle that has to be jumped. But if you're able to get that product to people and it's convenient and it's tasty, it works for them, they're going to buy it.
Excellent point, Brett. I love also that you brought up this idea of the supply chain being shortened as well as decentralized, because for where we're at right now, I mean, if you are in an area with high agricultural activity, the supply chain is shorter, but if you're in urban areas and cities, that supply chain becomes longer. And I think alternative proteins and technologies related to alternative proteins have the ability to shorten that supply chain. Brett and Leah, this is kind of a big question related now to marketability. From a regulatory front, we talked a lot about consumer engagement. Would you like to share with us a little bit about challenges related to regulations and engaging legislation from cultivated meat as well as dairy?
I'm happy to have the first crack. Yeah, I think this is a crucial question. We're a young company, so we started in March 2020, just before lockdown, and we were having conversations with investors at that early stage. And the second question they asked was, "What about the regulations? What do you think about it?" So we did a big deep dive into trying to understand that from a South African context. You look at what's happened overseas, particularly like through the US FDA, USDA. I mean, that process has taken like up to 5 years, if you're lucky, and it's still not complete. It's still open for public comment now. It took them 5 years to agree on what they're going to call it. Cell cultured meat, I think, is the ultimate, whereas cultivated is almost the industry standard. So the ability for regulations to hamper what we're doing is crucial. It's a massive factor. We've been very encouraged by the work that we've done over the last year and a half with food experts and legal experts in the country to understand the context in South Africa. And to do that, you've got to look at it, and I won't go into too much detail because it's boring and I don't really understand it. I don't want to understand it, to be honest. I want to make a product. Is that there are 3 bodies in South Africa that look at food, roughly, the Department of Trade and Industry, Department of Health, Department of Agriculture. There's a fragmented amount of acts that are associated with those different industries, and you have to try and pick and choose and be regulated by one of them. This is a very rough explanation. Also, it's South Africa, so none of those 3 governmental bodies actually want to do any work, so they don't actually want to regulate anybody because somebody else needs to do it. We've been able to look at some of that framework and that policy where we don't have to go to like an FDA or Singapore or a novel food or whatever it is in Europe and go and ask for approval. We can go and find the framework and work within it, and then hopefully then be able to come to market. That's a big hope. It's a big if, you could say. But I think we are a lot more encouraged by what we see here on the ground opposed to what we've seen in your equivalent, your Europe and the States. And I think that's a communication that we've been having with investors for the last 18 months, and it seems to be bearing a bit of fruit. It is going to be very difficult, I think, when we get to the retail component, when we start looking at labeling, because that's the Department of Trade and Industry. It's a very different conversation to agriculture, to the health component. The labeling is when they start getting a bit sticky. Yeah, I'm pretty confident that that's not going to hold us back too much, and there's ways to look around it. So we're going to be looking at food service in the beginning. You don't have to be a retail facing product just yet. I think there's going to be things that we look at to kind of say, let's speed this process up and then do exactly what we need to do to get a regulatory approval, but not let it hold us back too much.
Thank you, Brett. I think that's really knowledgeable from thinking about regulations from the technology and processes, so like health, safety aspect, and then labeling as a whole other front there. Leah, I wanted to see if you wanted to comment on the types of regulatory hurdles that your company is facing.
Yeah, sure. I think Brett painted a really great picture of the regulatory framework, and I think how we're looking at it is really from a classification point of view as well as from a technology point of view. So I think South Africa is quite great in that it has quite a robust regulatory framework for food. So because we're using GMO yeast, we are going to fall under a lot of the GMO regulations. And what's great about that is it's well regulated. So it's just about applying for permits to make sure that your factory and your facilities are GMO approved, and you're regulating so that you don't have any, yeast going out into nature. And, I don't know, people think it's going to grow weird arms or something, but so the idea is really about controlling it more than anything else. And we're focusing on a yeast that exports the proteins out of its cells, so the actual proteins are not going to be GMO. So in terms of regulations on labeling, our proteins are not going to be GMO regulated, just our production facilities. So that's our workaround on that front. The challenge going forward is really about classification of dairy and whether nature identical dairy versus precision fermentation dairy is going to be the way forward. So it's really about how we're going to word it. And like Brett said, South African regulators don't like the hard questions. So that's really going to be, I think, more of a challenge than the actual technology aspect.
Just don't tell anyone that we say that. I know this is being recorded, but
completely, Brett, completely not off the record at all, right?
No, that last 30 seconds you didn't have online. So.
Consider it encouragement for the government.
Yeah, and I think this point that you brought up, Leah, is a really important one. There is a difference between you shared with us about how consumers want something that's familiar, but now with regulatory hurdles, if you have to classify and label them differently now, then how familiar would that label be to consumers? I think it's an important conversation as well, right? Because it might be confusing if it tastes just like milk, but is labeled completely two different products. So kind of like I would say related to consumer perception, I was wondering about your opinion on alternative proteins from cultivated meat and dairy, more actually from the cultivated meat front on the religious perspective of like halal, kosher, and Shuda. What are your thoughts on this, Brett and Leah? I'm not sure if you wanted to jump in there, but I think it's more relevant from the meat front.
No, I think it's firstly a question that I've just been curious about for longer than the life of Mzansi. Just what will rabbis describe the meat that we're doing as? What will imams describe? When you look at the Hindu context, so in South Africa, I don't know if it's the same in the rest of the world, but in South Africa, the certification process is through Shuda, and that's to say it's classified as it fits within that framework. But we are going to be making bovine as a bovine is our process, and we want to make beef burgers. Now, is that going to be Shuda approved? I don't know. I mean, these are super interesting questions that I think are going to start arising. When it comes to the certification process, I think it will depend. I think these are questions that we are trying to also stimulate as well, so that people in the Islamic community and Jewish community can start having and saying and speaking to their own, because I mean that's actually where the answers are going to come from. It's going to come from the synagogue. It's going to come from a mosque. Like how do they qualify these things? If you look at it, there is no killing of an animal, so the blood component, which I think is the important part within. I think with both. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up a little bit, but the draining of the blood, I think in the slaughter process there is not relevant. So now, what are we able to not actually need to call it kosher or halal and still sell it, and Muslim and Jewish consumers are able to eat it? So I'm trying to skirt around the answer, but I think it's a very important one that we need to have. And I think we need to sort of not stifle, but grow that discussion within the communities that matter and see what their response is to it. I do know from being involved in plant-based foods for 10 years that it was always very contentious. So for example, our company was making plant-based burgers and sausages equivalents. As why are you calling it halal when it's not meat? And we had to call it halal because to say that there's no alcohol present. So it might be important for other reasons. So that unfortunately, people's knee-jerk reaction is to go and think about it in that way. But there's a practical thing so that Muslim customers can know that there's no alcohol, or Jewish customers can know there's no dairy, or something along those lines. So I think that's maybe the way to look at it, but to really start speaking about it openly and engage with rabbis and imams early on in the stage, and to get the input. And then when it comes to Hindu, I think it's just going to be a very interesting conversation. Dairy, maybe I can pass this on to Leah now, but dairy in terms of in India, I mean, that's a massive component there. So it might be quite relevant in that space.
Yeah, and I think it also becomes quite relevant, especially with in the Jewish religion. You can't really cook with dairy and meat in the same kitchen. Sort of how does that fit in when it's not real dairy products? I think it does become quite an interesting conversation. I don't want to speculate on it too much, but I do believe that because it isn't an animal, it would probably follow quite a similar approach to how you regulate normal food products when you apply for halal or kosher certification. And so they might take that similar approach because you're not really having slaughter per se. But I think much like the regulatory framework, it is a conversation that needs to be started early and sort of needs to be part of the research and development process as well. So, alongside technology, you have regulation and I guess, all the religious regulations that go along with it.
And maybe can I just add one other component to it, which is quite interesting for those maybe on the call that are interested in impacts. We found that having that halal logo on pack was incredibly powerful for a lot of Muslim customers when they travel. They don't want to go and they don't trust the butcher or maybe where they find themselves, and so they would go and buy that meat alternative because they know it's got the halal logo on it, and then they take it home. They're meat eaters, but now they're eating a lot of plant-based because of that. Same thing can be said in the kosher communities. We found that a lot of kosher people were again, meat eaters, but when they needed a quick purchase or whatever it is, that those two logos were just crucial in them actually making the purchase of the product. So I think from our perspective, and I think a lot of anyone else who's interested in getting the alternative proteins, there's a lot of benefits as well from ensuring that your products meet those standards, even though it's a big mission and getting approval by a rabbi or an imam, but I think it's very crucial to actually go and get more people who traditionally probably wouldn't go and eat a meat alternative product, but might enter the category now because they see that logo, which is familiar to them.
Brett, I think that's such an important point, again, about familiarity and that comfort, right? Understanding that from a social context as well. I wanted to turn over now to Amelia to see if we wanted to take any questions that came in live from the participants that were not previously submitted. Amelia?
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, Brett and Leah. This has been super insightful. We had a question, I know the two of you addressed this briefly, but about food safety. So what are some of your food safety practices to make sure, we hear so much about food safety. Are these safe alternative proteins? That remains a concern. So when it comes to biotech innovation, what kind of things that you guys doing at Mzansi and DeNovo to make sure it's safe?
I'll happily go first. We're still early stages, so we're developing all those processes now, but getting them right first is crucial. I think that food safety is, when food is such a contentious issue. If you get it wrong in an alternative protein, it's going to be far more difficult compared to the person that gets food poisoning from a dodgy burger down the road, So it's something to get right first off. I think the benefits in the long run that we're going to see from the industry that we are creating is that we will be able to have a lot more control of our environments, meaning that if it's a very, very sterile, there's not many, there's no live animals coming in, which is quite a complex thing to work out. So I don't know if any of you have actually been to a slaughterhouse. It's a very complex thing to get right. A lot of opportunities for disease to creep in. So I think we might be able to sort of circumnavigate a lot of that kind of stuff. So on the food safety thing in the long run at scale, we might be doing a little bit better there. And then it might result in less antibiotics being used. And then also might, just if you think about conventional agriculture at the moment, intensive animal agriculture, a lot of animals together, spending a lot of time and in a small space, a lot of disease prevalence. We might, in a couple of years' time, hopefully at scale, be able to circumnavigate, as I said. So that's the way that I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you made. We can now control a lot more factors than you can with animal agriculture. So on one side, it could actually be safer than animal agriculture. You're not going to get any diseases, toxins, or any of those carry-on zoonotic illnesses that can come through cattle. So I think that's one really important factor. From our point of view on the precision fermentation point, we're starting with an organism that has a GRAS status that's generally regarded as safe. So that's sort of the first stance we're taking to make sure that it is a safe organism. And then, following the very strict GMO regulations. But on top of that, we're working with an organism that can export the proteins, so that the proteins, we don't have to rupture the yeast cells and have any, let's just say, contamination with any of the GMO DNA. So we're taking a couple of extra steps to make sure that it is considered safe and that our proteins are removed from the actual organism. And then I guess the last step is really that we're going to do all the tests to ensure that the protein is nature identical, and nature identical way has a track record of being considered safe, except for people who are allergic to it, of course. So we're taking all those steps to really ensure that it is considered a food safe protein. And on top of that, the food safety precautions that would go into the manufacturing plant as well.
One of the things I think has been so incredible as I've covered the alternative protein space, I see so many, industry leaders being very transparent about what goes on in their brand and their product, which I think is so important as we've seen conventional food industry, especially some of our bigger Western CPG brands, fail at that they haven't been super transparent. Tell me what you guys see as far as, I've looked at both your websites, both your companies do a wonderful job at being transparent about what goes into your product. Tell me though, what do you see are the audiences most and least receptive to what you're doing?
Leah, I want you to go first once, because I want to get some more time to think about that, because it's a good question. And to be transparent, I just wanted to set the context to that, is that I'm a bit cynical of 10 years in retail and food, and just just do it. Just be a bit more transparent as a company. It's like people are so tired of hearing a bit of fluff. They actually just want some of the answers, and don't hold back, because as soon as you become cagey as a company, or you send out messages that are sort of convoluted, and they pick it up immediately. When it comes to something like sustainability, if you say you're sustainable and you then use something like palm oil, it's a flagging a question. It's going to be difficult. I think when it comes to our industry, in terms of what the real concerns is going to be where how we treat the animals in the beginning. There's been a lot of questions asked, like what does that biopsy mean? I mean, I didn't go into too much of the process, but what does a biopsy mean? What is it going to mean to the animal? And then the questions are on whether or not is there a process that's GMO. Leah spoke about that, and to be honest, there's a discussion that could be around that. When you look at an animal that is raised on GMO soy, is that animal then GMO if it's slaughtered and used for production? So I think there's also those questions that, to be honest, I am trying to unpack as well. Like, where do we call, what do we call as genetically modified as well? So I think that's a question that we've seen come up, the treatment of animals as well. And then also the media that we're going to be using, where we put the cells to grow, there are a lot of questions on that as well. And if it's feasible to be able to do that at scale. And we're talking scale that can, displace 70 billion animals a year that are being killed. The industry hasn't done it before at scale, so they actually can't answer that question. So I'm trying to be quite think about it a bit more before going out and saying that we know exactly what it's going to be like with all that media and being able to produce that kind of tonnage of meat at a later stage. I don't know if that helps, but those are some of the things that I'm thinking about on a day-to-day.
Oh, that was a great answer, Brett. What about you, Leah? Any further insight?
Yeah, I think two things that are stick out to me is that, you know, especially with these new foods, we are targeting a younger generation, and they're a very knowledge-driven generation. So you can't really pull the wool over their eyes, even if you wanted to. And if you were caught out, I mean, just with the amount of things that can go wrong with bad publicity in a company, you can almost not recover from it, especially if you're a young company. But I think what's even more important than that is working with new technologies, especially in food, which is such a personal thing for people. You almost want to get ahead of assumptions. So you want to be the one putting out the information and the correct information. I think GMO is a very good example. You know, it wasn't very clear what it was. And now, I mean, there's such a huge proportion of people that hate GMO, but if you ask them, they wouldn't really be able to tell you what it is or why it's bad or why it's good. And I think that's why it's so important, because you're working with a novel technology and you're feeding people with this novel technology. And so it's important to be transparent so that they feel comfortable and they can relate to what they're consuming. And so, you know, for us, it's important to be giving that information and to be giving the right information so that consumers don't make up their own mind, because that is so dangerous.
I would just like to add that, you know, kind of the consequence of consumer transparency is consumer trust, right? And once we build that trust around the food industry, or in some places of the world restore that trust, we can then create these familiar products with newer technologies, right? Amelia, I'll turn it back to you.
Yes, thank you for that. Okay, my last question. I love Josephine brought up the regulation question. You two both had really insightful points into that. One of the big it was interesting hearing Leah say that the bigger hurdle for your company right now is regulation versus technology. How disheartening is that for a startup? That I hope our government powers that be are listening to that. I wanted to bring up, here in the US, we have seen, the past, especially 5-10 years, government leaders pushing to, meat can only be traditional meat, and they're trying to push forward with legislation on that it only can be from a killed animal. Or same with dairy, that calling milk can only be from a lactating mammal. It cannot be from a nut or a plant-based or a cultivated source. That has been a big discussion here in the US in the food industry. Has there been similar discussions in South Africa? And how do you prefer to call, what would you like to see your product being called? What's your preferred nomenclature?
Sorry, Fred, I'm going to jump in there quickly. So what's interesting about our legislation is that we actually allow for plant-based milks to be called milk. So here in Africa, we're actually ahead of the US. Can you believe it? And so we actually facilitate for those sorts of products, which is great. Obviously, cell-based meat and precision fermentation, not quite yet. But I think it is definitely a route that we can take. Personally, I quite like animal-free dairy. I think it quite nicely explains what it is, without it being scary, because I mean, precision fermentation sounds like a mouthful, and I think if I didn't know what it was, I would also probably run away from it. So it's really quite nice in that it's animal-free, it's dairy, it's exactly what you know it to be, and I think that's quite a nice differentiating thing. So that's what I'm advocating for.
Yeah, thanks. It's cultivated meat is what we want, the preferred name that we want to be using, and we want to be seen, if there's meat and then there's cultivated meat, there's free range, grass fed, and under sort of that umbrella, and then ultimately grow so that we're more the preferred choice in the long run. I think when you do that question that you asked about, like whether there's a lobby or there's that type of pressure against something like us, to be honest, at the moment, I don't think they see us much of as a threat. And I know that because I've been told, which is fine, and I'll take that. Particularly from industry, you will see in South Africa, we don't have the same sort of pushback that you guys have from the cattle farmers. Like our versions, they're not, touch wood, but they're not seeing this is something that they would want to sort of lobby against. Where you might, when I kind of alluded to in the beginning, where we're probably going to see pushback and where we see already in the meat alternative space, is from the labeling component from the Department of Trade and Industry, working with more of your industry players that are front-facing consumer goods. And they're going to work with retail to kind of push and box out people if they don't like the way that it's labeled. As an example is that boerewors is basically that word that I mentioned at the beginning of the day is almost like verboten. You're not allowed to use it unless you're boerewors, and you've got to stick to it, like certain aspects that make it boerewors. And a plant-based meat company, the one that I used to work for, brought out a boerewors product, a sausage product, and they were trying to take it off the shelf because it's not, and then we were able to get away with it actually because they made it. The boerewors legislation applied to, I think, raw meat, and it was actually a cooked product. So South Africans are very entrepreneurial in trying to find rules and breaking them. But I think that's the thing that we'll probably be worried about at that stage. But remember, we're looking at retail, not in this year, not next. We're looking at down the line, and I think by that stage we have been able to work at it. At the moment, the Red Meat Association of South Africa, poultry folks, they are aware of what we're doing. I don't think that they're not turning in or keeping them up at night about it just yet. And I think that they would probably embrace us because of the ability that we would to fill some of the gaps that they are not filling at a retail level.
That
is very, sorry, Josephine, continue.
No, I wanted to say Brett brought up a really interesting point. Sometimes when I think about this, a lot of it scares me too, being a scientist as well. But I'm so hopeful of the future, right? Like Brett was saying, it's not next year, it's not 2 years, but 10 years down the road. And Brett brought up an excellent point about standards of identity and, being in a university setting, that's what we talk about. So one of the debates I have is, should standards of identity be removed, right? And these are generations that we're training that would eventually go into the industry that would have a completely different mindset, like what Leah was saying, that it's just going to be a different generation then.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great point, Josephine. Even you look at, 5-10 years ago, you were vegetarian or carnivore, and now we're seeing the term flexitarian.
Exactly.
Common.
I wouldn't have thought myself to even consider being a vegetarian, but now I am considering, transitioning to that for like health reasons as well as others, environmental sustainability. So I do see that shift happening already where we are.
Oh, that's encouraging to hear, and encouraging to hear South Africa is much more progressive in their food politics than we are here in the U.S.
Yep.
I would
all right.
just on that. Sorry.
Oh yeah, Brett, continue.
It's like. I think, the advancement in the politics that you guys I see as an observer of the States is possibly some of that downfall, that there needs to be that combative element, whereas it's less of that context in the South African place. So you're not going to go and have two parties that one's pro-farmer and one's not. It's a bit slightly different. So I think that plays to our advantage as well, that you don't see that sort of rush from politicians to go and say, I need to go and win votes in the rural area. It is, but it's not, from my experience rather, come from a food policy component. There's labor. We've got other things. We've got a lot of bigger other things that we're worrying about, unemployment, these types of things, like real issues that gives us focus on the ability to rather focus on food in a way that's not as divisive, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also just want to add to that. I mean, I sometimes find like the EU, for example, outregulates themselves a lot, and it can be quite hindering for innovation. And we actually get a lot of companies doing research in South Africa. And it's not to say that we don't have regulations in place. It's just that we don't make it impossible to do research, for example, or even, for example, with animal feed, a lot of the companies can't even do the research in Europe because it's not already regulated. Whereas here you can still do research to prove safety with animal feed or with food. So sometimes I find regulations to be quite stifling in some of the more first world countries. So we do have that advantage from a research and innovation perspective. And I guess it's slow everywhere in the world to regulate stuff. So we're on the same page there in South Africa.
Thank you, Brett and Leah, so much. What fascinating things your companies are doing, and really, value-driven missions. I appreciate you coming today, and Josephine for helping to moderate our discussion. Thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. We will post a recording on TFA's website in the next 24 hours. We also wanted to let you know that registration is open for TFA's first all-virtual conference in November called Fermentation 2021. Please go to fermentationassociation.org to get your ticket. And while you're there, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Brett. Thank you so much for teaching me about South Africa. Now I know more than Springboks. Awesome.
No,
Have a
that's
great
all you
day.
need to know.
Awesome. Take care, Brett. Take care, Leah. Thank you, Amelia.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.